He hadn't even finished his salad when Claire's father leaned in and asked, Did you check one of those diversity boxes on your application? Julian set down his fork, calm as ever, and said, I filled out the same form as everyone else, sir. What followed wasn't dinner, it was a quiet interrogation disguised as politeness, and Julian knew the room would never be the same. Hi, everyone. Today we're stepping into a story that doesn't unfold in a courtroom or a protest line, but around a dinner table. This isn't about shouting or slamming fists. It's about what happens when justice is tested by a smile and power hides behind a polite forkful of sea bass. And the man at the center of it all, he wasn't wearing a cape. He was wearing a cap and gown. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I'd love to know who's joining me around this virtual table. It started at Columbia Law School in an auditorium packed tighter than a New York subway on a Monday morning. The air buzzed with whispers and programs rustling as graduates sat upright in their robes, tassels swaying with each breath. Julian Reed, 26 years old, stood at the podium, no paper, no tablet, just a steady voice and years of lived experience balanced behind his calm expression. 3 years ago, he began, I walked into this building and didn't see a single professor who looked like me. The room shifted ever so slightly. Chairs creaked, eyes lifted from their laps. 2 years ago, I filed a case on behalf of Black tenants being pushed out of their homes, illegal evictions, dressed up as development. A faculty advisor told me to focus on things that would actually matter in court. Last year, I was told I was too assertive for a federal clerkship. I still got it. A few people laughed, the kind of laugh that stings with recognition. But Julian wasn't cracking jokes. He was building a mirror, and the audience was already catching glimpses of themselves in it. He spoke of the law not as a pedestal, but as a lens that revealed bias, fear, and silence, especially in rooms that prided themselves on being objective. The law reflects who writes it, who enforces it, and who's expected to obey without question. And fairness, he paused, scanning the rows of seated powerhouses, isn't a given. It's a fight, and it starts in rooms like this. By the time he said his final words, I didn't come here to belong. I came to build something that outlasts all of us. The auditorium rose to its feet, not all at once. Some hesitated, some folded their arms. But in the end, every pair of feet left the ground. Julian didn't wait for applause to die down. He walked off that stage the same way he walked onto it, steady, focused, and sure of himself. Backstage, he was swept up by classmates, professors, and even skeptical alumni now offering firm handshakes. But it was the look on his mother's face, 2 rows from the back eyes, brimming with tears, that made his voice hitch for just a second. She didn't say much, just took his face in her hands and whispered, You did that, baby. You really did. Julian smiled just for her. We did. He was still riding that current of quiet pride when Claire, his girlfriend of almost 2 years, found him near the catering tables. Her blonde hair was tucked behind one ear, her pale pink dress pristine and purposeful. She wrapped her arms around him and pulled him close. That was everything. You really, Julian, you took their breath away. He kissed her forehead. Think your dad stood up? Claire smirked, then rolled her eyes. Right at the end. But hey, progress. Julian tilted his head. Are we sure it's progress, or did he just run out of reasons to stay seated? She laughed, but there was tension under the sound. Listen, she said, brushing something imaginary from his shoulder. My parents want to take us to dinner. Just the family. Tradition. Julian's smile faded just a touch. Dinner, as in at their house? Yeah, Darian. It's only about an hour away. Mom says it's just a casual thing, celebration dinner. You, me, the usual suspects. He nodded slowly, but something in his gut tightened. You sure that's a good idea? Claire's voice softened. They need to get to know you better. And maybe, just maybe, they need to hear you speak when the room isn't full of applause. Julian looked away for a moment, then back at her. All right, let's have dinner. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew some battles aren't fought in courtrooms. They're fought over crystal glassware and roasted duck in rooms where power is inherited, and justice is just a word people think sounds noble on engraved invitations. And Julian wasn't walking into that house for permission. He was walking in to see what happened when the mask of politeness slipped just a little. They left Manhattan just after 6. The spring sun hung low behind them as Julian guided his car past the bustle of the Bronx and into the manicured calm of Connecticut. Traffic thinned the sidewalks, grew greener, and every turn brought wider lawns and whiter fences. Darien wasn't unfamiliar to Julian. He'd interned nearby at a legal aid clinic, but driving into Claire's neighborhood felt different. It wasn't the architecture. It was the invisible gate made of generations, the weight of silent expectations, wrapped in floral wreaths and wrought iron lanterns. Claire sat beside him quiet. Her phone buzzed with updates from her family parking instructions, dinner timing, wine preferences. She responded with emojis and quick thumbs, but Julian could feel the nervous energy in her fingertips. When they reached the Hollingsworth estate, it was everything he remembered from the photos and somehow even more curated. The house sat on a rise, its pale gray brick glowing under recessed lights. The driveway curved like it had been designed for formal arrivals. A valet, yes, an actual valet in white gloves, waited beside the steps. Julian glanced at Claire. "This isn't dinner," he said, easing the car to a stop. "This is a summit." Claire tried to laugh. "Stop." But she didn't deny it. Inside the house was pristine to the point of tension. Not a vase out of place, not a rug that dared wrinkle. White marble tile, polished oak, art that looked expensive and emotionally vacant. Julian grew up in Harlem. He wasn't a stranger to style or ambition, but this wasn't wealth that warmed a room. This was wealth that watched it. Elaine Hollingsworth met them in the foyer, tall, slender hair pinned like a senator's wife. "Julian," she said, like testing a new word. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Mrs. Hollingsworth," he replied, extending a hand. She didn't take it, just smiled. Thin. "Come in. Everyone's waiting." Claire's father, Richard, was already at the head of the dining table, flipping through a wine list with surgical focus. He looked up once. "Reed," he said, not standing. "The man of the hour." Julian nodded. "Mr. Hollingsworth." The dining room was stunning, long glass windows, a crystal chandelier hanging like a question mark, and a table set with napkins folded sharp as paper cranes. Julian was seated directly across from a woman in pearls, her smile more curious than kind. "I'm Margot," she said. "Claire's aunt. I hear you're quite the speaker." Julian gave a polite nod. "I try." She sipped her wine. "Impressive. Columbia law must be really focused on lifting new voices these days." Claire's spine straightened. Julian heard the sentence behind the sentence, but didn't blink. "It's a competitive process. Nobody hands you that mic." Margot smiled again like she'd scored a point. Salads arrived frisee with blood orange and fennel, and the servers moved like choreography. Claire's cousin Noah arrived late, gave Julian a respectful nod, and sat without speaking. Richard poured a deep red into his glass, swirled at once. "Law school," he said. "Tough business. What made you choose it?" "It's not exactly relaxing." Julian folded his hands. "I grew up around people who argued for their survival." Law gave that instinct structure. There was a pause, not long but noticeable, then a soft chuckle. "Well, you've got answers ready. I've been tested before," Julian replied. "Dinner smells great, by the way." Elaine smiled, proud of the cuisine, but not the conversation. The second course arrived, sea bass with lemon thyme, and more wine followed. Julian declined the refill. Margot dabbed her mouth delicately. "I read your article," she said. "The one about racial bias in housing codes. Very passionate." Julian gave a small nod. "It's personal." "Do you ever worry," she continued, "that injecting emotion into legal writing weakens its objectivity?" Julian didn't blink. "Some people don't need emotion. The system already works for them." Her fork paused midair. "I didn't mean to cause offense," she added quickly. "You didn't," Julian said evenly. "Just clarity." It wasn't the comment that made the air go still. It was what came next. Richard leaned forward, set his wine glass down, and locked eyes with Julian like he was examining a stock acquisition. "Let me ask," he said casually. "When you applied to Columbia, did you check one of those boxes? You know, the diversity ones." Claire froze. Noah glanced up from his plate. Julian didn't flinch. "I filled out the same application as everyone else, sir." "Of course," Richard said, hands raised. "Not saying you didn't earn it. Just schools are bending over backwards to hit quotas. Margot chuckled. My friend's son got rejected from Yale Law. Perfect grades, fluent in Mandarin. Lost out to someone with less traditional credentials. Julian tilted his head. Interesting how you know more about the person who got in than the one who didn't. Excuse me, she asked. Sounds like you're assuming your friend's son deserved it more. Because his resume looked like yours. Claire placed her napkin down. Dad. Margot. Can we just enjoy dinner? Elaine remained silent, slicing her fish as if nothing had happened. Richard leaned back. Relax. It's a conversation. I'm just getting to know the man you're so serious about. Julian picked up his napkin, dabbed his lips, placed it down again. Calm. I think the question is whether you're trying to know me or trying to corner me. I'm being honest. I appreciate honesty, just prefer it without condescension. Margot arched a brow. Sensitive aren't you. Awareness and sensitivity aren't the same. And awareness has kept people like me alive in rooms like this. That one landed. The room shifted. The server cleared plates faster than before. Claire leaned closer. I didn't know they'd come at you like this. I did, he whispered. She squeezed his hand under the table. Margot wasn't finished. You're very composed. But how do you plan to survive in high-stakes law if you're always on edge? Julian's voice didn't rise. I've argued in courtrooms where my clients were presumed guilty for how they looked. I've stood before judges who called me aggressive for not backing down. If you think this is high stakes, you haven't seen anything. No one had a comeback. Dessert was announced, but nobody reached for it. Julian sat still, a calm storm behind his eyes. The table didn't know it yet, but they were about to hear the most honest voice in the room, and it wouldn't be his. The table had gone still. Not a dramatic kind of stillness, not the kind that comes with shouting or slamming doors. This was the kind of quiet that makes the air feel dense, like the room itself was holding its breath. Julian didn't rush to fill it. He simply took another sip of water, steady as ever. No glares, no sighs, just the weight of truth sitting in the middle of the table, like an uninvited sixth course. Claire's cousin Noah hadn't said much all evening. A hedge fund analyst barely into his 30s, Noah wore his tailored navy suit like armor. His Rolex slid slightly on his wrist each time he adjusted his sleeve. But now his fingers tapped the stem of his wine glass, slow and deliberate, like something inside him had just cracked open. You know, he said, voice quiet but clear. I used to think conversations like this were exaggerated. I thought people were too easily offended, too emotional. Every head turned toward him. I figured, if you're smart, if you work hard, the rest works itself out. He looked at Julian. But last year, I worked under a guy who never let me lead meetings. Never once. Even after I landed the firm 3 new accounts. He said I was too soft. Margot blinked. Noah, that's... He cut her off gently. Then we hired someone new. White guy, loud, average performance. Took over presentations in his second week. Our boss said he had presence. He paused. And I realized, we don't all start from the same place. And some of us have to prove we belong twice. First with our resume. Then again the moment we walk into the room. Julian met Noah's eyes. A nod passed between them, silent, mutual. Not gratitude, recognition. Claire leaned back, visibly exhaling. Elaine finally looked up from her plate, lips parted like she'd swallowed something too sharp. I didn't expect to feel ashamed tonight. Noah said, his voice steady. Not of Julian, of how used to this I've become. No one moved. Even the servers seemed to hover farther from the table now. Richard shifted in his seat, trying to wrestle the moment back under control. I'm not saying there's no bias out there. Of course there is. I just don't think every situation has to turn into a lecture. Julian smiled faintly, not with humor, but with exhaustion. It's only a lecture if you already know the lesson and don't want to hear it again. Noah added, or if it makes you uncomfortable enough to finally listen. Elaine placed her fork down. The clink rang louder than it should have. We didn't mean to make you feel like you had to defend yourself, she said, her voice soft. Truly, Julian. That wasn't our intention, I know, Julian replied. And that's part of the problem. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with the weariness of someone who had explained himself one too many times in rooms that should have known better. Margot folded her napkin with sharp, slow fingers. To be honest, Julian, you made me feel like I couldn't say anything without it being interpreted the wrong way. I know that feeling well, he said. I've just had more practice living with it. Again, silence. Then slowly Julian stood, not to storm out, not to lecture, just to meet the weight of the moment on level ground. I appreciate the dinner. I really do. But respect isn't just about being invited. It's about being treated like I belong without having to prove it first. Claire stood too, slipping her arm into his. Her face was pale, but her voice was clear. I'm sorry, she whispered. Julian gave her hand a light squeeze. It's not your apology to make. But just before they could excuse themselves, something happened that no one expected. Elaine cleared her throat. Julian, she said carefully, could I speak with you later? Privately, Claire looked at her mother surprised. Julian gave a small nod. Sure. He didn't expect much. A gesture, maybe. A bandage over a bruise. But something in her tone suggested she'd heard more than she'd ever planned to tonight. Back in the car, the silence was thick, but not suffocating. Claire stared out the window, eyes glossed with questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. Julian kept both hands on the wheel headlights, sweeping along darkened streets and half-closed storefronts. I didn't think they'd go there, she said finally. Julian didn't take his eyes off the road. I did, she hesitated. You said as much, but I hoped it wouldn't happen, that just once they'd act like decent people. He turned down a quieter road, trees arching overhead like folded arms. They didn't yell. They didn't curse. They didn't call me anything ugly, but they still made me feel like a stranger in a room I was invited into. Claire leaned her head against the window, her voice barely audible. I should have stopped them sooner. Julian glanced at her. Why didn't you? She didn't answer right away. When she did, the words came slowly. Because I didn't want to believe they were like that. Because it's easier to pretend people you love don't carry those ideas. And maybe because I was afraid that if I spoke up, they'd look at me the way they looked at you. That landed harder than anything else she'd said that night. Julian pulled into a small side lot near a closed cafe. The kind of place that smelled like cinnamon in the morning and espresso at night. He parked and let the engine tick itself quiet. You love them, he said. I do, she whispered. But tonight made me wonder if they really know me. All of me, including the part that loves you. He turned toward her. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about what you're willing to tolerate in the people you love. Claire's eyes shimmered. Why didn't you just leave when it started? Why'd you stay? Julian exhaled through his nose. Because I've walked out of too many rooms already. I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed and told the truth. She nodded. And I think, maybe for the first time they listened, even if they hated every second of it. He reached over, brushing her knuckles with his thumb. What about you? I heard everything, and I hated how familiar some of it sounded in my own head. I let so many things slide because they weren't aimed at me, but I don't want to be that person anymore. Julian gave a small smile. That's the real reason I stayed, to see if you would pretend, or if you'd name it. She reached for his hand again, this time fully. No hiding it under the table. No worry who was watching. I'm not pretending, she said. Neither of them spoke for a while, but the silence now, it felt different. 2 mornings later, Julian sat at his kitchen table in Harlem, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the sun inch slowly across the floorboards. The apartment was quiet save for the occasional hum of a car down the block and the distant sound of someone shouting instructions at a dog. He liked mornings like this, still unscripted, but today something hovered beneath the calm, a kind of aftershock that hadn't settled yet. His phone buzzed once, then again. He picked it up and saw 2 notifications. First, new voicemail from unknown number. Second, text from Claire. Call when you're free. Mom wants to talk. He hesitated, then pressed play on the voicemail. Hi, Julian, this is Noah. Claire's cousin. A breath. Just wanted to say thank you. I've been in a lot of rooms like that one. Heard a lot of things I let slide. Swallowed too much silence for the sake of keeping it professional. But you said what I never had the guts to. I've already had 2 conversations this morning that felt different, more honest. I don't know what happens next, but I needed that. So yeah, thank you. The message ended with a soft click. Julian didn't move for a few seconds. He just let the weight of the words settle. Then reluctantly, he opened Claire's text again and hit call. Elaine answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, controlled, like someone reading carefully from a script, but also someone trying not to stumble. Julian, she said, thank you for calling back. He didn't speak. I owe you an apology. He waited. I didn't speak up the other night, not when I should have, and I let my silence say things I didn't mean to say. I'm not calling to explain myself. I just want to say, I heard you, and I'm sorry. There was a pause. What did you hear, he asked. She didn't dodge it. That you felt on trial at my table, that my family made you feel like an exception instead of a guest, and that I didn't do anything to stop it. Julian breathed in slowly. That's a start. They didn't speak long. No long confessions, no exaggerated promises, just acknowledgement. But in rooms like the one they'd all sat in, even acknowledgement could feel like an earthquake. Later that afternoon, Claire showed up at his place with two things in her hands, takeout from a Korean place they both loved, and a neatly folded piece of paper. She emailed me, Claire said, holding out the paper. Margot. Julian raised an eyebrow. She said she couldn't say it out loud. Not yet, but she needed to put it in writing. He unfolded the email. Julian last night challenged me more than I expected. You were right, I didn't listen. I reacted. I've been so used to my version of the world that I never stopped to question what it cost others. I'm going to do better, not for your approval, but because it's overdue. Margot. He read it twice, then once more. It wasn't poetic, but it was honest. You read it, he asked. Claire nodded. She sent it to me too. Said she needed to sit with her discomfort before she could own it. That's something, Julian said quietly. They ate on the couch, no table, no place settings, just legs tucked under them, cartons balanced on knees. It felt more like home than any chandelier-lit dinner ever could. Between bites of spicy pork and kimchi, Claire asked, Do you regret going? Julian thought for a moment. I regret that it went exactly how I thought it might, but no, I don't regret staying. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Me neither. They sat like that for a while, letting the city hum around them. The next morning, Julian drove to the legal aid clinic, where he'd interned during school. It wasn't required. He didn't have an appointment. He just wanted to walk the old halls, talk to the new batch of interns, remind himself why he chose this path in the first place. As he stood in front of the building, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a name he didn't recognize. Hi, Julian. I'm a friend of Noah's. He sent me your graduation speech. Just wanted to say, thank you. You put into words what so many of us feel every day. I've already shared it with my team. We needed it. He put the phone away, but not before noticing a strange lightness in his chest. Not relief, not pride, something quieter. The sense that something had cracked open in more than one room. That evening, Julian called his mother. They talked about the dinner, not in detail, but in feeling. She didn't ask what was said. She just asked, Did you speak your truth, baby? Yes, Ma. Then that's all that matters. Before hanging up, she added, But you know what I would have done? I would have taken a picture of their faces when you didn't flinch. Julian laughed. That's why I'm your son. That night he sat on his small balcony with Claire, a blanket around their legs and a mug of tea between them. The city moved below them, subways rumbling, voices rising and falling. And for once they let the quiet between them mean rest, not avoidance. Claire spoke first. I've been thinking about what you said, about rooms you walk into knowing you have to prove more in one night than most people do in a lifetime. Julian nodded. I want to help shift that, not just for you, but for whoever walks in after you. He turned toward her. Then stay honest, stay loud when it matters, and never think silence is the same as neutrality. She held his gaze. I won't. And as the city lights flickered below, and the wind picked up just slightly, Julian realized something. Justice wasn't always about verdicts or marches or breaking news. Sometimes it was about breaking silence, about refusing to shrink, and about standing so firmly in your own truth that the room eventually has no choice but to shift around you. 2 days later, Julian returned to his routine case files, community meetings and court prep for a small civil rights nonprofit on the Upper West Side. But something was different now. Not in the work itself, but in how the work landed. He wasn't just chasing outcomes anymore. He was tracking echoes, those soft, barely there reverberations that prove truth when spoken. Plainly didn't disappear. It traveled. He sat at his desk on a gray Tuesday morning when his inbox pinged again. Subject DEI committee proposal approved. He blinked. It was from Noah. Message: the board voted yes. Full rollout starting next quarter. Optional training made mandatory. They want you to speak to the department. Thought you should know. Julian leaned back, a slow breath escaping his lungs. He hadn't asked Noah to act, hadn't followed up. But there it was, action. Not just apology, change. He tapped out a quick reply. Proud of you. Let me know when you need me there. Later that week, he spoke at a local youth mentorship event in Harlem. Mostly high schoolers. Some nervous. Some pretending they weren't. One young man in a thrifted blazer stood at the edge of the gymnasium floor, clutching a folder with every internship and scholarship he'd ever tried to get. After Julian's talk, the student came up, eyes wide. Mr. Reed, can I ask something? Of course. How do you stay calm when people are talking to you like you don't belong? Julian smiled gently. By remembering I'm not there for their comfort. I'm there for the person watching quietly who needs to see someone not shrink. The boy nodded slowly, like he was filing that away for some future moment. On the subway ride home, Julian thought about that boy, and Claire, and Noah, and even Margot. He thought about how justice never looked like he expected it to. It was slower, messier, quieter. It didn't explode, it shifted. And sometimes all it needed to start was a dinner where someone stayed in their seat, spoke clearly, and refused to let silence win. That weekend, Claire invited him to a brunch with her friends, artists, writers, a few over-caffeinated nonprofit folks. It was held in a loft apartment with creaky floors and folding chairs. There were mismatched mugs and secondhand couches. No marble, no chandelier. But more warmth than Julian had felt in days. Afterward, as they cleaned up together, Claire said something he hadn't expected. My mom's coming into the city next week, she said. She asked if she could meet you again. Just her. No plates, no napkins. Julian paused. You think it's worth it? Claire looked at him. I think she's trying, and that matters. He nodded once. We'll see. That night, Julian walked back to his apartment alone. He passed bodegas with flickering lights, a barber shop still buzzing after dark, and a little girl jumping rope in a puddle by the curb. He looked up at his building. Not grand, but it stood, and so did he. Because in a world where power often hides behind civility and bias wears the mask of curiosity, standing your ground was a kind of justice all its own. He reached his door key in hand, and before he stepped inside, he thought about one last thing. You don't change the world in one dinner, but sometimes you change someone's silence into a voice. And that's enough to start something. Sometimes justice doesn't kick in a door, it just stays seated when everyone else expects you to stand down. Julian didn't change the laws that night. He didn't need to. What he changed was a room, a mindset, a few hearts that thought they already knew better. And that kind of shift, that's the long game. It's easy to think injustice only shows up in headlines or handcuffs, but more often it's tucked into compliments, hidden behind good intentions, served with a silver spoon and a carefully worded question. That's why voices like Julian's matter, not because they shout, but because they hold steady. They name things, they draw lines, and they remind everyone in the room that presence is not permission, it's pressure. A quiet, firm challenge, rise to meet me or reveal who you really are. If you've ever been in a room where your worth was quietly measured before you even spoke, know this: you don't owe anyone comfort at the expense of your truth. You are not there to be tested. You are there to be heard. And if you can't change the whole room, change one chair, one person, one echo that carries farther than you realize. To those watching tonight, I hope this story gave you something real, a mirror, a nudge of memory, and maybe even a push to stay in the room long enough for it to shift. Because it can. It does. Slowly, stubbornly, and only if someone's brave enough to stay seated and speak. Thank you for being here.